Welcome to this episode of the Justice Team podcast on the Justice Team Network, where we give practical advice to lawyers. I'm your host, Bob Simon, and we are honored today to have Mohamad Ahmad coming to us from Southern California, live from Los Angeles, who also practices in Atlanta, some other states. He has a bicoastal practice. He also lives internationally and sometimes in the United States, sometimes other places, which we'll talk about how to do all those things, and also be an amazing trial lawyer. I know he's a finalist this year for Trial Lawyer of the Year for the biggest plaintiff bar organization. Mo, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, what's this shirt you're wearing? I thought it was a hot dog cart, but what is this?
Yeah, a lot of people think it's a hot dog cart. This is actually a Jerusalem bread cart. So I live in Jerusalem part-time, and they have these ancient bread ovens, like hundreds of years old, if not 1,000 years old, where they bake bread every day in the morning. My father-in-law and my wife are obsessed with this type of bread. It's like sesame bread. I'm not really a big fan, but it's tasty. So she got me this cool shirt in Jerusalem. So
nice. So yeah, let's jump into that then. I mean, I know your wife and kids are in Jerusalem. You're here in Southern California, sometimes Georgia. What's that like, man?
It's fun in a way because you get to go to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem it's a city that's locked in time. Yeah, like when you're there, if there were no cars, you would feel like you're back, from the ancient times. And there's actually some villages in Jerusalem and Israel and Palestine where you actually can experience what it was like back in the time of Jesus, where you have and if you go to Nazareth, there's like a Christian village, and they do this. They kind of, it's like a museum, but you really feel like you're back in the old day. They do olive press by hand, and they have like donkeys and stuff like that. So it's a throwback to time, and it's also fun, but it's also, you also miss your kids, so it's been about 2 years now, and at the 2-year mark, that's when it really started being tough, being away from the kids for so long.
Yeah, I just saw a missed call from my kids' elementary school. I know there's a problem, so I'm going to text my wife and say, they just called me. It's likely our 7-year-old that's causing problems in school. Do your kids ever cause problems in Jerusalem? You have younger kids too, right?
Yeah.
You have twins?
Yeah. No, they're 9 and 7 now.
Yeah.
But my older kid always causes problems in Jerusalem. He got caught with a vape at school.
Sounds very familiar to what I just got.
Yeah, and my wife freaking out, and I don't really care. I'm like, whatever. Where did he get it? This is funny. They're kids. They'll do crazy things. My younger kid, he initially had problems with the school, but then he became like the fan favorite at the school. And so my wife will go pick him up, and he'll make everybody stop the game when he's leaving. And then my wife will be like, no, you can't be a dictator. And the teacher will be like, no, we call him the director.
But so how do you realistically do this? You have a litigation and trial practice, and you guys do some complicated case. I mean, you do a lot of electric shock, burn injury cases.
Yes.
And then, I've seen the verdicts you've had, 8 figures, high 8 figures on these types of cases. How are you able to, literally be, what, are they 12 hours ahead in Jerusalem from LA?
They're 10 hours ahead in Jerusalem. So I work on American time. So when I'm in Jerusalem, I go to sleep at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning. Sometimes I'll go to the ancient mosque, the Aqsa, the famous mosque, at like 5 in the morning, pray, come home, and I'll fall asleep at like 6 a.m. And then I'll wake up at like 1 or 2 p.m. there, spend some time with the family, and then begin my workday at like 6 or 7 p.m. there.
Wow.
And then I'll stay up all night, because if you sleep, you can't really sleep so I stay on American time, and that's how I make it work.
But you still get family time in though before your quote unquote workday starts back in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like you get 4 or 5 hours of family time, which is realistically, that's what happens here, right? If you go to work early, you come home at 6 or 7, and then you spend 2 or 3 hours with the kids and the wife, and then you go to sleep. So it's kind of the same thing. Obviously, the wife would prefer that I worked on Jerusalem time, but I just work on American time. And with COVID, you can take depots.
Do you have any problems taking remote depositions from there?
No, never. Sometimes there's like sirens and shit going off, but like other than that, no. It's pretty chill.
And then what happens, what's it like though? Realistically, you have multiple week trials. I know you had one in Northern California earlier this year. How are you able to do that?
That's easier, right? Because the family's not here. So I spent it was last year, we spent 6 weeks in Monterey. And, my business partner was flying home with his family. My associate was flying home to spend time with his wife. I didn't have that. So in a way, it kind of makes it easier when you don't have the family to go home to. You just have trial. So I stayed up there the whole time.
Wow.
You know, so in that way, it made it easier. And then a month after that, my friend got stuck in a crazy small case in Georgia and was like freaking out, like, hey, I talked shit to the adjuster and I can't try a case. Can you help me? So I flew from Tel Aviv to Atlanta. We tried a case, you know?
Yeah, you have an office in Atlanta as well.
Yeah. And so that's kind of fun and also stressful, you know, where you're calling, you're like, dude, are they really not going to pay the $25,000? And he's like, yeah, they just offered 10. Mm-hmm. So fly down. So I was like, all right, jump on a flight, fly down. But what was cool about that case is they actually paid for my flight. Even though it's not a recoverable cost, he just included it in the cost memo, and they got scared because we got over the policy limit. And so they just paid everything, attorney's fees, costs, everything.
Well, thank you, State Farm or Allstate or whoever it was for paying for your trip to Tel Aviv.
It was progressive, yeah.
Progressive.
Yeah.
And you're also a very progressive guy. So look at that. We tied it in. Well, no, so I do say this all the time as a trial lawyer. The only thing now that I physically need to be in person for these days are the trials.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're a living, breathing example of this.
Yeah, exactly. I was literally in another country, 10 hours away, flew in, and then within 48 hours, I was picking a jury.
And since you're staying on American time, you're not dealing with jet lag or anything.
Yeah. No. And then the one thing is that, you know, with points and with status and whatnot, I always get lie flat. And so that makes it easier, I think, when you're sleeping on, like I can sleep on the plane the whole time.
Wow.
You know.
Yeah. So walk us through. So we talked about a little bit of the lifestyle stuff. Do you have to operate on the same consistent type of systems? I mean, Georgia's different practice law than California where you're practicing. So how are you able to manage that? I mean, you guys on systems or anything like this?
Yeah, in terms of
like back end systems or
yeah. So they're very similar. There are certain things that are different. What we try to do is make them the same. Right. So, for example, in Georgia, you have fact depots and trial depots. They're actually distinct. Right. And in California, you kind of have that too, unless it's like a doctor that's unavailable or whatnot. So what we try to do is take whatever exception or whatever there is and make them the same. And so in Georgia, you can do a trial depot. If it's, you know, like the opposing party, you can use that for any purpose. So we convert those into trial depots. Instead of it being a fact depot, we make that a trial depot. In California, if the person's, you know, like my Monterey case, everything was more than 150 miles out. So every single depot was a trial depot. And so you just try to make everything a trial depot. And you take a deposition like it's trial. And depots really lead the case, right? Yeah. There's discovery, there's back-end discovery motions to compel, to kind of bother them a little bit, but depositions are basically trial. And so we try to treat our depots like trial depots, present them like trial depots, and use any excuse to make them play that trial.
All right, so let's transition over into your trial practice, litigation practice, and you're known for doing catastrophic injury complex cases. Let's talk about the burn and electrical cases. What are some things that, I mean, a lot of lawyers refer you cases to work on. First of all, how do they find you? What's the easiest way for people to find you?
You just, you know, email or text. You know what I mean? Like I probably text is better than email. You know,
text, yeah, same thing. I hardly check emails. I check our Slack chats on Justice HQ. I check my texts, and that's about it.
Yeah, even a voicemail. Like I check my voicemail. I'm like, oh shit, especially since I'm always traveling. So if I'm on the plane and I get a voicemail, I normally don't check my voicemails. So text is the best way. I just get
the transcribed voicemails because there's no way I'm ever going to listen to it. Yeah, I know you called. I saw the missed call.
Yeah,
you leave a message, and if it's transcribed, so walk us through what we're missing on these electric shock cases, because sometimes they're public entities against Edison or some other things. Like, what are we missing?
The biggest thing people are missing is don't be afraid if the symptoms are delayed, because that's when you know the client is actually telling the truth, is when the symptoms are delayed. And so you know, the defense counsel will tell me like, oh, your client didn't present with all these issues right away, and I go, dude, if he did, he'd be a fraud, you know, unless it's like a super catastrophic case, because you're going to have issues with like seizures 6 months out, you know. So if the client's presenting with seizures right away, that's abnormal. But 6 months out, a year out, that is normal.
Why is that?
They don't know, because with electrical cases, most people die, right? So if your client survived, it's either not severe or it's super severe, and they don't know what to do with it. I mean, how many electrical cases are there? There's probably like 500 in history that survived a catastrophic electrical shock. And so doctors don't know what they're doing on those issues. Doctors sometimes don't know what they're doing on a neck issue, right? Like
trial and error.
Yeah.
Like we had one electrical shock case where it was so powerful, guy lost his arm.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the most contentious litigations we had, and we resolved it for a lot. But they're hard liability cases, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I'm sure he had a brain injury too.
Yeah. Yep.
But they disputed that, and they're like, "Oh, this is just an arm case." That's what they did in mine. This is just an arm case.
Because these are very, because a lot of times when you have electric shock cases, it's usually a premises case of some kind, right? And then sometimes there's a public entity involved.
Yeah.
So walk us through the target defendants on these types of cases and what things you're looking for.
So the target defendants, like you said, is going to be a public utility, which in California you need a 6-month notice. In Georgia, you need a 1-year notice or 6 months, depending.
And that means you have to file a claim.
You have to file a claim, and in Georgia they're very slick about that. Like in California, they're more loose with it, but in Georgia they'll try to evade service and be like, "Oh, you served it to my office, but you didn't serve it to my desk," and they'll file a motion to dismiss. So whenever there's a public entity involved, you definitely want to get like a high-level technical lawyer involved, because you can mess those up very easily. Then you also look at, like, even if they're not an actual utility, they might be a quasi-utility. Like in our case, it was the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the world and the largest generator of solar power private. So they're effectively a utility, even though they're not officially a utility. And there's a lot of lobbying involved, so they don't get regulated as a utility. And then so you go to them and you find out, okay, what did you do? And then obviously they try to disclaim liability, blame it on the employee, because workers' comp in Georgia and California is a bar. If you can't sue your own employer, generally speaking. And so that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to find the big entity, trying to define what they are. Are they public or private? And depending on what benefits them, they'll define themselves as public or private. If there's an immunity, they'll say, "Oh, we're public." If there's no immunity, they'll say, "Oh, we're private."
And that's where you can't trip up, and you got to file the claim form and be safe.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's where, like, a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of target defendants. It's usually an employee that gets hurt. Every case that I've had is the same way. And you have that workers' comp crossover.
Yep.
And a lot of times, if you can actually show the employer was negligent, you can get a big reduction or get the employee's medical lien waived.
Yeah.
At the end.
And so in our case, the jury found that the employer and the employee, my client, was negligent or were negligent, because both of them, but they were not the substantial factor. So we got 100% liability on that.
Wow.
And that was worth, the $160,000 medical lien. It's like that if they got 10%, it would have reduced the verdict by $5 million.
But how do you prove that there was a surge of electricity that came from the public entity and not an employee severing the line?
So for that, what I would recommend is, first, the lawyer needs to kind of become an expert. Like in my office right now, in my actual physical office, there's the box that triggered the injury, and another for that case, and for the most recent case that we just settled for nearly $5.5 million. I kind of recreated the incident in my office again. I think the lawyer needs to be able to explain it to the jury. So the lawyer needs to be the expert. So for my Monterey case, I was the smartest person in the room on that issue. And the jury kind of learned that right away. Even though I'm not as articulate, I stutter. Like the defense lawyer was way more articulate, less stuttery, more polished, but he didn't know his ass from his elbow when it came to the actual incident.
Well, how did you learn this stuff?
I physically went to the site, talked to my client endlessly, talked to other people endlessly. And then, and I recommend you do that early on, because then when you start talking to third-party witnesses, like we interviewed dozens of third-party witnesses, they're skeptical, right? They're like, who's this lawyer? They have their own lawyer because it's the employer, so they're represented. But as soon as they talked to me for 5 minutes, even the employer's lawyers were like, dude, this guy knows his shit. And so they all trusted me. And so they cooperated. And that's not always the case, but it took a lot of time on my part, like to understand what was going on. I talked to other lawyers, they helped me understand it. And just workshopping the case. Like that case was an example of teamwork. Like Justice HQ met with dozens of lawyers and we talked about it. Cala, lawyers helped me on Cala. Gary Dordick helped me. Sean Claggett, Claggett, Matt Granda's on JHQ. Sean Claggett and Jordan Logan. I spent a whole day with them working on the case. Dan Ambrose from TLU, weeks with Dan Ambrose prepping the case because Dan is like a freaking workhorse. So he forced me to work on the case. And then the Jerry Spence College, like it was literally like a Jerry Spence verdict. There was 4 of us from the ranch there.
Wow. And how big was the verdict?
51 million.
51 million.
Yeah.
And, you talked about the labor of love, the stuff that you have to do in the prep to get there. Now, one thing you did was very creative on, and it's very hard to understand, is the damages in this case.
Yes.
So how did you work up the brain injury, the general damages for an electrocution?
So the way we did it is one thing I don't like to use lien doctors, and so we used the workers' comp doctors to establish the damages.
And you can usually videotape their depositions
yes.
as a treating doctor.
Exactly. And then what I did is I used before and after witnesses, and I even used the defense witnesses to establish how badass my client was to the project. And I told the jury, I said, look, we're asking for 46 million in damages for Kelly. I said, don't look at the day before the incident. I want you to look 18 months before when this $1 billion project was on death's door, and they called Kelly, my client, to come save the project. I said, this is how the phone conversation would go 18 months before the incident. Hey, this project is in the hole. We need Kelly. And the CEO says, get Kelly, whatever it costs, get him over there to fix this project. It's a $1 billion project. We need him. And they'll be like, we can. He's damaged. He's like, what's it going to cost to fix him? 46 million. He'll say, write the check. He's worth every penny. Mm-hmm. I was like, that's how you have to look at it. Don't look at it the day after when he's useless to the company. Look at it when the company needed him the most and he delivered. And that's who he was. Even the defense was like, we all knew who he was. He was a badass.
And that's what a lot of lawyers get, they think they have to over-expert the case, get a neurologist, a neuropsychologist. And I'm like you. I think before and after witnesses and maybe a physiatrist that can piece it all together to meet the standard. Yep. And that's all you need.
That's it. And that was our main witness, the physiatrist.
Yeah. Which one, if you don't mind saying?
Topher Stevenson.
Oh, he's awesome.
And the reason I like Topher is he actually cares. He met with the client. He legit cares. He was a smoke jumper, so he himself is a badass physically.
What is a smoke jumper?
Where they like go in and I believe it's when they go in and they try to prevent limit the exposure of the fire. Wow. So they get dropped in. They get dropped into like a danger site and they freaking yeah. So he's a legit badass himself. So and my client was a badass. So they could relate to each other. I couldn't relate to my client. My client could bench more than me even after the injury, right? So I was like, we can't relate to each other, dude. I'm a dweeb, so we're not going to relate. But Topher could relate to him, but Topher is also a badass.
Yeah, I think physiatrist is a way to go.
Treating physician. He gave him, and he didn't even do expensive stuff. He did like this cream, and my client's like, this cream is working. I was like, so we don't need a surgery then. Don't be afraid to do less medicine if the damage is there. And in my case, the damage was clearly there. Anybody even a blind person could see the damage was there, right? So, but it was just communicating that story and maximizing the damages.
Yeah. So I know how to find you by text or Slack at Justice HQ, and to find you on Attorney Share to refer you cases for those that are out there. But how do other folks find you if they want to get educated on, how to have an international practice and family, or to litigate these tough cases? How do they find you?
Yeah, just hit me up or my business partner Ray, RK at Cremani LLP or MA at Cremani LLP. And, we're down to talk to anybody.
Thanks. Well, Mo, thanks for coming on the show. Big fan of yours. This is the Justice Team Network, Justice Team Podcast, and he's the go-to for these types of cases. Thanks for coming on, buddy.
Thanks, Bob.